What's good, YouTube? This is Who Was Like God, and I'm coming back with another video because yesterday I was actually reading through the book of Peter, and I believe it actually has really interesting insights for how the first century church worked, and gives us insights based on that perspective from really studying the first century church. Is how it could be unified as believers and understand what really is the Church of Christ, and what terms reflect what was going on biblically and historically when it comes to that. So the verse I want to read is 1 Peter 5:1, where it says, "So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is to be revealed." So the part I wanted to emphasize is that very first verse, where the Apostle Peter is addressing fellow elders or fellow presbyters in his letter. And who is Peter writing to? He is writing to the believers in the diaspora. Peter 1:1, he says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia." The Apostle Peter addresses who he's talking about, these various exiles and those in the diaspora in Asia Minor, essentially. And he lists out Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And the interesting thing is how a little bit later he puts himself on the same level playing field as the elders in these churches, in these places. Why is that important? Because on this channel, we've been doing the work to understand what really is the Church of Christ, especially from its earliest Israelite foundations. What we understand is, as history goes on, those within the church who would be within the church, biblically speaking, there's developments into how the church is understood. The study of ecclesiology. So there's developments in how church structure is understood along the lines of apostolic succession. I have a couple of videos where I go into this. So some churches today will define the legitimacy of Christ's church along the lines of apostolic succession. So the laying out of hands from one bishop to the next is the guardrail for valid ministry in that perspective. And that's how many people today in the apostolic churches, which again would include those ancient African churches, Ethiopian and Coptic. Hey, mama. Now the thing is, the really study of the first century church, what we can see is they didn't necessarily know apostolic succession that many people take for granted today. So the earliest church, the definition that would have represented the foundation for all of us, what definition of church would they have meant, would have represented all of them? When the first century believer referred to another first century believer and they understood themselves as part of the church, what would have that meant to them? Because it wouldn't have been along the lines of the institutional definition of apostolic succession, which developed past their time. And what we can understand in the first century is that not every place that had believers on account of the apostles had bishops appointed by the apostles. You see what I'm saying? I'm going to say that again. Not every place which believed on account of the apostles, preaching of the apostles, directly interacting with the apostles, had a bishop appointed directly by the apostles. When you try to harmonize everything we have from the first New Testament and other sources, what you can see is not only are there places where the community themselves appointed bishops or appointed elders, there's also places that we know had believers based on the book of Acts and based on the New Testament, like where Cappadocia is name dropped, where I know there were believers there in some capacity that go on record as not having an appointed bishop for a couple hundred years. Same with Ethiopia. So not only is not in every place that believed directly from interaction with the apostles now have a bishop appointed by the apostles, there are places that appointed their own bishops apart from apostolic appointment. And there's also those that didn't even have a bishop at all until a couple hundred years later. But among those that did have a bishop or an elder appointed by the apostles, it would have been in this really early understanding of an elder or a bishop, a presbyter, because that was really seen as the same role early on. And then as time goes on, there's a distinction between presbyter and bishop, where the bishop is seen as above the presbyter. And even as that distinction happens, we can look at Ignatius and see that it's the presbyters who are seen as succeeding the apostles, not the bishops. And bishops had congregational authority. There's a Protestant scholar, Gavin Orland, who really studies this and makes a lot of work with that. But even this stuff has been acknowledged by Catholic scholars. People from the apostolic churches have also acknowledged this. When we can be as objective and intricate, there is a development in how church government is understood. So based on these developments, which exceed the time of the initial deposit from the apostles, who were all Israelites, what is the definition of church that would have represented the first century church? Least common denominator definition of church that would have represented everybody from the beginning, as the faith is released, as the faith and constants of salvation and doctrine have been established for the earliest believers, what is that constant that we can continue throughout all centuries as other things develop? So what I try to argue and articulate for on this channel is that the least common denominator of church, the first century church, would have been all those within biblical doctrine, in their assemblies within biblical true doctrine, right? Which we can see the scriptures do define, and certain false doctrines that are explicitly warned against. Not only from all those that would represent places where a bishop, an elder, was appointed by the apostles, it would represent those where that wasn't the case, and it would represent those where there was no bishop at all. It would also represent those who in the really early stages, after being convicted of the Messiah from preaching like the Apostle Paul, would have continued to understand and acknowledge Christ in their local synagogues, right? Which is really how even the Apostle Paul, the apostle of the Gentiles, would preach to the Jew first, and would go to synagogues first in the cities. And those that would believe, receive the word, most likely would continue to go to their synagogues even after that conviction. You see what I'm saying? So based on the development of how the church government is understood among certain churches and other churches that didn't even have that, among also the Messianic Israelites from the foundation that would have continued to worship Christ within their own kind of church government in the Jewish Israelite synagogue context, what is the definition of church that would have represented everybody who directly had contact with the apostles themselves or their preaching? That definition would be all of those guys would be legitimized in their assemblies by those who hold to biblical and apostolic doctrine. So I make that point to say is when we really study and we look at all the traditions we have of where the apostles appointed successors as bishops, the traditions are in Antioch, the church in Rome, which the apostle Peter and Paul were said to be appoint successors in. You have the church in Jerusalem, which represents the earliest believers that actually continue to have leadership after the time of James, as well as the church in Alexandria, where the bishop appointed by St. Mark was an Israelite and native of Alexandria. So when we look at the churches that were understood to have successors appointed by the apostles in the various lists of bishops from that perspective, we see it's Alexandria, Jerusalem, Rome, and Antioch. To go a step further, it's also said that St. John appointed a successor in Asia Minor, as well as Philip in Asia Minor. Well, Asia Minor is a big region. If we really get into it a little more specifically, we can see there's a tradition that John the Apostle appointed a successor in Ephesus. That's what we have from a relatively early tradition, that St. John the Apostle John was really around the church in Ephesus and that he's appointed a successor in Ephesus. We also have a tradition of the Philip the Apostle, who is said to have become the bishop of Traios from the other apostles. And it's also said that Bartholomew appointed a successor after Philip had passed away. So trying to look at all the traditions we have of where an apostle was said to appoint a successor, we have Jerusalem, we have Alexandria, Egypt, North Africa, we have Rome, and we have Antioch, and we have Ephesus and Traios. I want to be as intricate as possible, because when we look for traditions that we actually have of the apostles appointing successors, understand that none of those places are who Peter addresses in 1 Peter. Means in this really early understanding of what a bishop was, this elder over a visible community of believers, before there was the connotation of apostolic succession that comes later on, there would have been people who were appointed by the community who were not appointed by the apostles at all, who would have been seen on the same playing field as the apostle Peter. You see what I'm saying? 1 Peter 5, Peter says he's a fellow elder to the elders in all of these cities that he's addressing, who wouldn't have been appointed by the apostles when you look at all the traditions of what is said to have been successors to the apostles in the world from the first century appointed. You see what I'm saying? So I do think the traditions are relatively early, and it's probably true that the apostles did appoint successors in some places. But when it can be as objective and intricate about how that is understood on the field, in the field with people like Ignatius and Irenaeus, to synthesize all of that, it seems like there would have been this really early understanding of elders from the early Israelite context, presbyters and bishops, elders, so to speak, seen as this one role. And among all these different places, there are some places where the apostles appointing successors in these places to be elders over their churches, and there are some places where they didn't. When we can look at all of the evidence based on the traditions of where the apostles appointed successors, as well as the testimony of other records where some places have their own bishops appointed from their own stuff. And we can see like in the Didache where we know that was happening, as well as how Cappadocia didn't even have any bishop on the record until a couple hundred years later. The reason that's so significant is that it means the apostle puts these elders, these bishops, these presbyters who are not appointed by an apostle at the same level playing field as himself. They're equals, which means is that there was a real, when you look at the earliest church, there was a really valid ministry and a valid application of being an elder, even if you weren't appointed by an apostle at all. So again, bring all this together to understand what is the first century church. And we can see that there are people where some churches were relatively early traditions, the apostles did appoint successors. But there are also churches where there's the bishops, the elders were not appointed by apostles at all, but rather the community that was there that are exalted and seen as the same playing field as the apostles themselves. Based on the scriptures and the parameters given for overseers, these communities were appointing people by themselves, is what we see evidentially. Again, looking at who Peter is addressing versus all the decisions that we have, where it was said that a successor was appointed, and none of those places being represented by who Peter is addressing in these places that have elders in their churches, meaning that they were not appointed. These elders that Peter is addressing were not appointed by apostles, and yet they're still valid and seen as legitimate by the apostle Peter himself. Again, people in the earliest church, when we look at various different churches and developments of these churches at different times throughout history, the universal global church in the first century was not defined by visible succession from apostolic appointment. Not only are there places like in 1 Peter 5 where we know there are elders, presbyters, bishops, whatever word you want to use, that were not appointed by the apostles, who are seen as being at the same level as the apostle Peter and same level as those who would have been appointed, meaning there is some meaning that the legitimate church from that sense is not defined along the lines of apostolic appointment, as well as those places like Cappadocia and Ethiopia that didn't even have any appointed leader for a couple hundred years, where we know there were still believers in those communities. When you take those things, as well as the fact that there are Messianic Israelites, Messianic Jews who continue to meet among themselves in their own systems of worship and church government that are already established before the revelation and resurrection of Christ, who continue to, most likely, foundation of being probabilistic, continue to go to synagogue with their faith in Christ. When we can look at all these early people who would have actually directly interacted with the apostles in their preaching, the term that would have defined them, that would have defined the church in that century, would not be the same term that a lot of us will use now when it comes along the lines of apostolic succession, because the offices and theological implications of that developed beyond the first century, where not every church had a bishop appointed by the apostles, and some didn't even have a bishop at all, where we know there were communities of believers. And again, when it comes to the episcopate, so to speak, there was this understanding of presbyter and bishop being virtually the same office, based on the New Testament and other documents, which is this connotation of an elder, right? So when they say presbyter or bishop, think of an elder over in a community of believers, right? And then as time goes on, there's a distinction between presbyter and bishop, where the bishop is seen as a head of presbyters, who are basically a college of elders at a local church, a local community of believers, and then the bishop is above them, who has congregational authority in the earliest understandings. But it's the presbyters, the elders, who are seen as the successors, not the bishop above them. So even when there's this clear distinction between presbyters and bishops, it's the presbyters who are seen as successors of the apostles, not bishops being directly appointed by them. So all bishops being appointed by the apostles in that early time has to be understood before this understanding develops past the first century. You see what I'm saying? So just trying to be objective with all the information we can. What we can see is that the first century church cannot be defined along the lines of apostolic succession. There has to be a terminology and a time and place to define the church along what we find biblically and historically in the earliest stages. What definition of church would represent the believers in the first century? And there's even precedent in church history for people like Jerome, people who come later, who even recognize the developments in church structure, which would logically mean the first century church was not defined by structures that would develop after its time. I saw all of this to say is that really studying the first century church can really be a prospect for church unity from the perspective of semantics and how we define your terms. If you come from a specific theological vantage point of how the church is institutionally, that's fine. But if there's a precedent, as there has been, to how we define our terms in this ecumenical conversation, such as church institutionally along really rigid apostolic definitions, or church just as an assembly, Well, when he can define church along the lines of, earliest church first century wouldn't have been along those apostolic laying on of hands, bishop to bishop lines, assembly, so to speak, with the least common denominator of church, then we actually have a real concrete historical core to this conversation where there's been a precedent towards dialoguing about what is the church and seeing different people as valid depending on the definition of how you define church among different denominations. See, one of my biggest passions is church unity. And I think one of the biggest catalysts of that is how we define our terms. And along the lines of what is the first century church? Because see, everybody operating today in biblical doctrine, truly biblical doctrine, who appoint their leaders along the lines of the qualifications that are given in places like Titus and Timothy, all of those casts will really be moving in accord of the first century church. They would be legitimized as actual churches from the first century standard. When we're talking about semantics, the study of how we define our terms along the lines of what we can concretely find biblically and historically, using the definition that would have represented everyone in the first century as believers and keeping that as a constant through our history in light of whatever developments you may have elsewhere. You see what I'm saying? From that perspective, I made this point before. I love having the Hebrew Israelite conversation when it's in the right spirit and right doctrine. And should many of these Hebrew Israelites get into the right doctrine of God, then again, with this standard that we have set out, a lot of the developments from the ground up, the first century church, a lot of these Hebrew Israelites would be legitimized as first century churches, the first century church structure and definition and assembly, if they truly surrender completely to biblical doctrine, which many of them have not. So with that being said, I hope this helps. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah. Obviously, I do want unity within the global church, but it's not a false kumbaya sense of unity that avoids the issue. Pursue complete truth. But when we do it, there's principles based on the historical definition of what the church would have been and principles from the scriptures, as well as the deposit of faith that we come from, that frame the conversation when we do have it. A lot of principles to frame the conversation about theological disagreement between different denominations and assemblies and churches from our common history, that we can have that conversation in the right spirit when we get to it, based on this shared sense and shared brotherhood we would have when we can look at these things and what they would have been from the beginning. All right. Peace.